So I'd like to start by welcoming everybody here to our My Carbon Zero launch webinar, where we've entitled it Going Beyond Carbon Neutral, and have great pleasure in introducing my fellow presenters today, all the way from Perth in Australia. Staying up late to join us is Sandra Krempl. Sandra Krempl, and Sandra is the CEO of Trillion Trees, and we'll have a presentation from Sandra later where she will share with us about Trillion Trees. And with us also we have Heloise Buckland, and Heloise is the co-founder and CEO of Husk Ventures, which we just referred to as Husk. Again, we shall allow Heloise. Heloise will be joining us later with a presentation about Husk. But before we do that, I'll just give you a quick rundown about what we're going to talk about today. And so it's all about introducing My Carbon Zero. And so there's the introductions quickly done. And but what I want to just do is give you a little bit of the background about the philosophy that underpins My Carbon Zero. You know, what was the idea behind it? Where did it come from? So that's the history. And also just spend a little bit of time going through how it works, this concept of what we're calling the RRRI actions. Try saying that late at night. Triple RI actions, and this whole concept of going beyond carbon neutral and offsetting. And then we'll invite Heloise to join us and share us about Husk, and then Sandra will join us and share about Trillion Trees. And then right at the end, I'll just talk about getting started, if you're interested in getting started with your own My Carbon Zero journey. And all of that, our aim is to be done in about 45 minutes, and to leave about 15 minutes there at the end for questions if people are interested in joining. So that's the overall agenda. Now, if you've got questions, please do pop them in the chat. And I want to just introduce two other people who are helping us today with the moderation, and that's Lydia and Sam. And they work with me here at the Pond Foundation, and they're going to help us out with just making sure everything works. And we've got a few polls that we want to share with you as we go. And so they'll be posting those little polls, just little questions, and just to get your thoughts as we go through. So I'll leave that to Sam and Lydia. So, oh, hold on, there was two slides. So just going back to this, I'm unfortunately in loading it up to Easy Webinar, it's got a bit scrunched up. Maybe you can see it better than I can, but it looks a bit scrunched up to me. And it was supposed to go step by step, but it doesn't seem to want to do that today. But just wanted to talk to you. This was a concern. This really was the motivation that I had for thinking about My Carbon Zero. And, you know, for a long time, and people who know me know that I've been working to protect forest conservation for a long time. And that actually links all the way back to my 15th birthday, when I was inspired by Richardson Bar Baker, who is in fact the founder of the Men of the Trees, and linked very strongly. And Sandra will tell that story about Trillion Trees in Australia. But I heard him on the radio, and so I did a lot of work in forest conservation. But what I realised was setting forests aside, as was happening with the work that I was doing with the Forest Trust, wasn't going to guarantee their protection. And part of the problem was climate change. Of course, setting them aside, they could be subsequently cut down later. One of the issues really was climate change. And as temperatures increase, we find ourselves, and this was really back in 2014 and 15, I sort of had this reflection that how exciting it was that companies were making these fantastic pledges to set forests aside and not fell them. But I realized that if we didn't get climate change under control, as the temperatures kept rising, the trees would be cooked. They'd be cooked in their own juices. The forest would dry, fires would come, there'd be pests and diseases. And so these magnificent forests that were being set aside all around the world, which we felt good about, and rightly so, were nonetheless still in grave peril. So we had to look at what we could do to get climate change under control. And so I started thinking about this and what could I do? And I looked around the sort of initiatives that were out there already, where people were, you know, talking about offsetting and things like this, and it just didn't seem to resonate with me. So I came up with, you won't find this this magnificent graph and drawing in any scientifically reviewed paper, but it's sort of my summary of what I understand when I read IPCC, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports on where we're headed. So here we are in 2020 over here, and 2100. Everyone looks at forecasts to 2100. And these blue lines going up here represent possible scenarios: 1 degree warming, 2 degree warming, 3 degree warming, 4, 5, 6 degree warming. And of course, there was much rejoicing a couple of years ago after so many meetings, UN meetings, where nothing happened. In Paris, there was this commitment by world leaders that we would aim to keep ourselves to 1.5 degree warming. This sounded great. It was encouraging that people had finally made this commitment. And the idea was, here we are. I'm hoping you can see my cursor moving around there. This is where we were in around 2020, was just above 1 degree, about 1.1, 1.2. And the philosophy, the idea of the Paris Agreement is, through our collective actions, particularly governmental actions around the world, we will track here and we will come neatly in under this red line over here at 1.5 degrees. Okay, Sam just tells me you can't see my cursor, but no worries. You'll see over here, Paris, where I've got that little line. The idea is we'll tuck in under there and it'll be magnificent at 1.5 degrees and the world will all be saved. Sounds great in theory, until you realize that if you look at a lot of the things that are happening now, are trending towards what the climate scientists the world over are calling worst case scenarios. And they're looking at the melting permafrost, they're looking at methane bubbling up from the Arctic, they're looking at the Greenland ice sheet. And so if you look above 2100 there, you'll see that big, bright red star. And in fact, it seems that we're trending towards a more than 6 degree warming. And we should be concerned about this, because at more than 6 degree warming, no large mammals can live on the planet. And of course, we've all got that large mammal look about us. So this should bother us. Not only should it worry us about the trees and all the other species that we're concerned about, but that seems to be the path on which we're heading. And most recently, having read quite a lot of articles and seeing what the scientists are saying, I come back to this other red circle over here. Unfortunately, you can't see my circle, but you can see the closer red circle with that sharper red line going through it. What's happening now is that a lot of the scientists are saying things that we were predicting in the worst case scenario are actually happening now. They're either happening now or they're happening in our lifetime. So we're trending in a much sharper temperaturized scenario than even the worst case scenario. They're looking to rewrite and revise their worst case scenarios. And of course, this is pretty worrying. These things happening now. And I call this gap between where we are today and this idea that we'll fit snugly in under 1.5 degrees with all of our actions under the Paris Agreement at 1.5. I call this gap the deep poo gap, because I think we're in deep poo. And we've really got to try and take some serious action about this. And this really was the underpinning philosophy that came during 2014 as I reflected on what people were saying was a great achievement to get so many forests set aside by palm oil companies and food companies. It was great, but we weren't where we needed to be. We needed to go more. So my question was, how do we go more? And this really was the impetus to start thinking about My Carbon Zero. And in 2016, I had the good fortune, October 2016, I had the good fortune of talking to Professor Klaus Lackner. Professor Lackner is the director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at the Arizona State University. So he's looking at ways of using technology to remove carbon from the atmosphere. He's all for tree planting, he's all for soil carbon and all other ways that we can get carbon out of the atmosphere. But he wonders if we can accelerate that process, because all of the IPCC models make it clear that even if we all reduce our emissions to zero tomorrow, we're still in trouble because of all the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So all the IPCC models and Professor Lackner are making it clear that we actually do need to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So he's looking at technology to do that. But one of the great things that he said to me was this idea that carbon is a waste management issue. And he said, look, imagine every year you as an individual throw 10 tons of rubbish on the street in front of your house. And you've been doing that all of your life, as have your neighbors. So all of this rubbish is coming here outside. my street, and it's coming up onto all up and down the street. And this pile of rubbish is growing and growing. He said, that's like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? And he says, if I come to you and say, but hey, I'm a good person because this year I'm going to reduce that and I'm only going to throw 8 tons of rubbish on the street. Well, that is good, and we should celebrate that, but it's not enough, because that 10 tons that I've been throwing all of my life is still there, and I'm still throwing 8 tons of rubbish out there as well. So he made it really clear that this whole idea of just trying to reduce our emissions wasn't enough. Oh, we've lost Heloise for a second. Hopefully she'll be back in a second. So it wasn't enough. So this was inspiring to say, okay, so what do we need to do? And so in January 2018, having invited and sought to inspire companies to remove their carbon emissions since their inception, I realized that I had to take action myself. It wasn't enough to call on a company to take action if I wasn't prepared to do it myself. So in January 2018, I wrote a little blog, and oh, Heloise is back. She just turned off her video. Okay, great. She's still there. I started My Carbon Zero as a concept where I started investing to take my carbon out of the atmosphere. And here we are today in November 2020 to do a more formal launch of that. So I just wanted to talk through how it works. Why is my slide doing that? See if I can go back. It might be a heavy slide. Oh, there we go. Just go back one. There we go. So how does it work? So what we're looking to do here is, and apologies that it's all come up at once, but it doesn't matter. I think it's easily to see. So we have your carbon balance sheet. So what I worked out was, well, what are my lifetime emissions? How much carbon have I put up into the atmosphere? Have I thrown out on the street since I was born? And so I looked at all of the places that I'd lived. I worked out the per capita carbon emissions, and I added them all up, and I came up with a number. I'll show that to you later on. And then I said, okay, so that's my balance sheet. I've got these liabilities. This is all the rubbish that I've thrown out on the street. What am I going to do to get that out? And here comes this idea of the RRRI actions. So the first idea was I needed to reduce my emissions. Living here in Switzerland, I put up about 7 tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. In Australia, it's more like 17, and that's because we burn fossil fuels for energy. Okay, but here in Switzerland, about 7. But I can still reduce that. So what actions can I take? And I call these R1 actions. What actions can I take to reduce my annual emissions? So for example, I could travel less. I could drive less, I could fly less. I could also change my diet. So instead of eating so much meat, for example, that's one thing. I could also look to reduce my emissions elsewhere, and I call these R2 actions. So I, for example, sponsor girls' education in developing countries. And that really stems from the idea that highlighted in Project Drawdown, that girls' education is a great way of reducing future emissions because they have a chance to get a job, they have a chance to control their lives and their own fertility if they've had this education. So educating girls is a great way of reducing future emissions. Then the key thing I think that sets My Carbon Zero apart from other initiatives is these R3 actions, where I remove my carbon from the atmosphere. And this is where we've partnered with Trillion Trees and with Husk to invest in projects that remove carbon from the atmosphere. Okay, we'll let them talk about that. Sandra and Heloise talk about that in a second. And the last one is to inspire others to do the same. So if I've started on this journey, I'm really hoping that I can inspire other people to join this journey too, and start their own RRRI actions. So that's how it works. We talked about this whole idea of beyond carbon neutrality and beyond offsetting. And just to finish up my introduction is really to say carbon neutral, and I think this is evolving and it's changing, but typically carbon neutral, companies that claim to be carbon neutral, talk about their emissions for this year. So for this year, as a company, I've emitted 1,000 tons. And what I've done is I've reduced that to 800 tons, and I've invested in projects somewhere else that will reduce the emissions over there of 800 tons. And this is where offsetting comes in. So a couple of things I have issues with that. One is that, look, that's great. It's great that you're reducing emissions, and it's great that you're investing to reduce emissions elsewhere. These are R1 and R2 actions, but I don't think it's far enough. There's also issues with offsetting. we know that not always do the numbers add up, that my 800 will be offset by the 800 over there. There's also issues with paying large amounts of money to get projects up to speed so they can receive those carbon investments. It costs projects like Trillion Trees or like Husk or like other projects a lot of money to get themselves developed and then certified so that companies would invest. And I would rather see that money going to tree planting or going to biochar production to put that carbon into the ground or into the trees. Okay. So, and the other thing that hangs out in the air here is that it's usually only for 1 year, and all of that pile of rubbish that I've got sitting on the street is still there. Okay. So we want people to take responsibility for that. So these are the differences that I see between the My Carbon Zero approach, this comprehensive, credible approach beyond carbon neutrality and beyond offsetting. More and more people are starting to talk about carbon zero, which is great. There's lots of different definitions out there. Maybe we can talk about that in the questions. But right now, I'd just like to pass over to Heloise Buckland, and the co-founder and CEO of Husk Ventures. Heloise, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you very much for inviting me not only to this webinar, but also to the My Carbon Zero community. I think it's a really pioneering idea. And actually, just before I start talking to you about Husk, I just recommend anyone to watch a little video that Scott's done on, it's posted on LinkedIn just a couple of days ago, I think, or recently. I'm sure Lydia can share the link. But what was inspiring for me was that when Scott worked out his entire footprint of his lifetime, flying around as a forestry executive around the world, and he got to this number of the 500 tons. What was interesting to me that he said, even though he drove an electric car, even though he decided to go vegan, which I only discovered through watching this video, having known Scott now for a couple of years, he only just mentioned in passing that he went vegan to reduce his footprint. Even then, he still had these 500 tons to offset. And I know offsetting is not the word that we should be using, and we need better vocabulary for positive climate action. But it was really inspiring that we can't depend just on governments, on businesses, on corporations, on policies, on Kyoto, on Paris. It's us as individuals right here now that are part of this mess. And we're the ones as the mammals, in under threat of extinction. So I really admire Scott's vision and leadership on this concept of My Carbon Zero. The my being the important point, right? So this is, we're all part of this. So anyway, just thanks for that. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Please let me know if you can't. So anyway, I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about Husk and how I got to dedicating my career to building soil and sinking carbon, which is what we do at Husk. Where it all started is in Fiji, where I grew up, hence some shells there, which reminded me of my childhood. In Fiji, we often had hurricanes and would go 6 months without water, 3 months without electricity. We'd often have problems with the resources that we all rely on: electricity, water, energy, and so on. And so from a very early age, I realized that we depend on nature, we depend on the environment, we depend on the resources around us to meet our basic needs. And if we don't look after those resources, then we're not going to have water, we're not going to have food, we're not going to have electricity and telephones and all the luxuries that we usually enjoy. So I think from a very early age, I realized that climate change was significant, and the hurricanes were getting stronger, they were getting more regular. And I believe now, this is one of the extreme weather patterns is something of major concern. So that was my childhood, my inspiration to look at climate change. Fast forward 20 years of working on several climate change related environmental, sustainability, social innovation initiatives, I then discovered rice husk. and discovered this with my business partner, Carol Rios, as something that has a very low value, is an agricultural byproduct that we felt as two entrepreneurs that we could add value to and support smallholder farmers with, and do something about climate change. So that's the background: aware of climate change, a career in sustainability, and now doing something very, very material, which is turning rice husk into biochar to improve some soil fertility, to increase farmers' yields, and to sequester carbon. So I'm going to just share, that's my story, but you're probably much more interested in the story of some of the Cambodians who we work with. So Scott, could you stop sharing your screen and then I can share mine? I think Scott might be muted. Okay, great. So, okay, thanks. Yeah, share my screen. So let me just, bear with me, everyone. Right, so I want to introduce you to Moy Viesna. So Viesna is a young farmer from Cambodia. I've been working with Viesna for the last 18 months, as many other Cambodian farmers. And Viesna's story is that his parents used to have a rice mill in the village. So his parents had a farm, small vegetable farm. And what they would do to improve their soil is go to the local rice mill, take the husk from the rice mill, put it into a pile and put a metal tube into that pile and burn the husk. They used to call it cook the husk, until it became a carbonized rice husk, so a black rice husk. They would then take this carbonized black rice husk and put it on the soil. And Viesna and his family told me that this makes the soil soft, because they have very hard clay soils in Cambodia. So this tradition of carbonizing biomass is what we now know today as biochar, has been going on for thousands of years. The first remains of biochar are from the Amazon, and most cultures with ancestral knowledge that's still alive still turn biomass into biochar and put it on the soil to act as a soil improver. However, in the case of Viesna, there is no longer a village rice mill, because through industrialization in Cambodia and in most countries, the rice husk now piles up at the mill, and there is no village mill. So he doesn't have access to what he used to be able to make in his own backyard. So he now buys cheap synthetic fertilizers, which end up degrading his soil. So Viesna obviously is not alone. Viesna is one of potentially 1 billion smallholder farmers around the world who grow 80% of the world's food. So these are the people that we're all really depending on. So what we have done with Viesna and other farmers over the last 18 months is develop a business that enables Viesna to access this ancient technology of biochar, soil improver, from his own country, from the rice husk in Cambodia. We've packaged it in a bag, we've set up a distribution model, and we're getting it back to him and back to his soil. So the scale of this challenge is obviously huge, as I've just mentioned. 1/3 of the world's soils are degraded. So Viesna is one of these many smallholder farmers who has degraded soil. And unfortunately, this soil degradation is worsened by climate change. And then we get into this vicious cycle of poverty, climate change, and soil degradation. So how we've addressed this is that, and how our biochar products also sequester carbon, just given that we're in this My Carbon Zero framework, the plants absorb the carbon from the atmosphere, as you can see in this diagram. And then the paddy, which is the rice plant, is processed at the rice mill, and the husk is separated from the grain. You can see a picture here of our first installation in Phnom Penh. We then take that husk, just as Viesna's family did in the past, and turn it into biochar. However, we do a little bit more than that. We also we blend our biochar with other nutrients, and we create carbon-based fertilizers, so that there's something that's ready to go in the soil that not only has the capacity of the biochar to hold on to nutrients, to hold on to microorganisms and to hold on to water, but we also blend this with more immediate macronutrients that plants need to grow. So the farmers then buy our products through our distribution channels that we've set up, and the carbon that was originally absorbed by the plant goes back into the soil. And according to the IPCC, biochar is now recognized as one of the 5 main carbon removal technologies available. And if we scaled up the production of biochar, we could remove around 3 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. We've just started in Cambodia. So the carbon that goes back into the soil, the IPCC also states that it will stay there for at least 100 years. However, as I mentioned before, there are remnants of thousands of years ago of biochar in the soil. But our story is not just about carbon sequestration. It's also about improving smallholders' livelihoods so that they can stay on the land, look after the land, and keep growing us food. And so what we've been running trials over the last 3 years with different organizations to see how the yield increases when biochar is in the soil. And we've had an average of 29% increase in yield, which means farmers are getting an increase in their revenues. So this is one of the co-benefits, if you like, of carbon sequestration through biochar. We're not just removing carbon from the atmosphere, but we're also improving farmers' yields and incomes. And we're fairly ambitious with our mission. You know, we've started in Cambodia. We've spent the last 18 months proving this concept with a small industrial unit, and we are now on a path to grow and scale up our impact. So our vision long term is to be able to get 1 million tons of carbon back in the soil by 2035. And to help us on that journey, we've actually just become certified as the first European biochar certificate carbon sink outside Europe and the US, which means that for every ton of biochar, we're offsetting 1.33 tons of carbon dioxide. And we're recognized by one of the leading biochar institutions to do that. So that's our carbon mission, but we also want to regenerate a soil. So we have a mission to at least, get up into the hundreds of thousands of hectares of soil. At the moment, we're on 8. The figures are a little bit better than that now. And we want to improve lives. So, we hope with this mission of building soil, sinking carbon, and improving lives, we could potentially benefit just under 1 million smallholder farmers. And this is Viasna's mother. So she was the lady who actually was making her own biochar along with her husband. And as we know, most of smallholder farmers are women. We're also a women-led company. And I'm really very pleased to be sharing this webinar with another woman. So I guess I will leave it there for now, but really delighted if anyone has any questions. I'm sure I've gone over time. But perhaps to say, if you are interested in supporting our work and supporting My Carbon Zero, then please do purchase a husk removal credit. You'll get a certificate. And what you will be doing is helping us to build soil, sink carbon, and improve lives in Cambodia for now, and hopefully in other countries as we go forward. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Heloise. Thanks very much for that. And it really is an inspiring project. And it now gives me great joy also to invite Sandra Krempl to speak to us all the way from Western Australia, from an organisation that's very dear to my heart. So Sandra, please.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you so much for this opportunity to appear on this webinar and to be part of My Carbon Zero. It's very, very much appreciated. And Heloise, it's so great to hear the work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing. And I didn't know you had a childhood in Fiji. So that's very interesting. Yes, I spent so many years in Papua New Guinea. But to get started, just listening to both Scott and Heloise talk, I feel that our work, before I start on the history, the great shoulders of giants that we stand on, what we do is actually simple, and it's the simplicity of the task that is important, because what I feel, and what I believe the organization also shares, is there is such a disconnect from all things natural. And there's also a disconnect from what the scientists say, and, you know, carbon and climate change and everything. People are getting desensitized to all of that. And it's all important work, but I feel equally as important is the message of connecting with the wider community, people in our urban context, and they are increasing in population numbers around the world. The urban cities are growing bigger. And how do we get simple messages of living simply and not having that accumulative waste? So this goes back to a story that I love, and it's with the person that I consider our founder, Richard St. Barb Baker. And it goes back to Kenya, to 1922, would you believe, where there was a realization that a collaboration needed to happen between the Kikuyu people of Kenya and with others to realize that something had to happen to stop this culling of trees without replacing them. Yes, we need to use trees, but we need to replace the ones we use. Or as Richard St. Barb Baker used to say, the desert would encroach further and further into our land. And he worked with the Kikuyu people and marked a special day with a pledge that they would plant trees. And plant, I think it was something like 10 more for each one that they cut down. And that celebration was marked with a dance for the trees, song and dance, and the words that emerged was from the Swahili language, and it was called Watu wa Miti. And in fact, those words were translated as men of the trees, but they were more accurately translated as people of the trees. But in those days, if you can remember 1922, it was all thought to be mankind. So everything was considered man of this and mankind of that. So that's how men of the trees became the translation. But through that beginning with the Kikuyu people and Richard St. Barb Baker was the foundation of what grew to be more than 100 Men of the Trees organizations around the world, which enabled people to do their own thing and plant trees. It's a simple enough complex. Yes, I know the logistics can get really crazy sometimes, but the concept is simple enough so that anybody can do it. And almost like in synchronicity, something else was happening in a different part of the world a few decades later. And I'm going now to about the 70s in Western Australia, where a young filmmaker by the name of Barry Oldfield was commissioned to make a film about salinity in Western Australia. And he decided the best way to get the information out was to get an economist to do the presentation. And we're talking about an economist called Ernst Friedrich Schumacher. Don't know if you've heard of him, but he is was a world-renowned economist. And he wrote the book, Small is Beautiful. If you've not read it, you should. It's incredible to hear those combinations of economic speak and the ethics of living simply. And through this film, the film was called On the Edge of the Forest. Schumacher talked about the whole salinity problem and all the rest that goes with it, the whole cycle that goes with this series. And it was through that film that Richard St. Barb Baker got wind of this whole thing and decided to come out to Western Australia. Cut a long story short, hence the founding of Men of the Trees in 1979. And that now is called trillion trees. But what happens to the salt? The problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it has become worse. And I refer to an ABC Australian Broadcasting Commission documentary. I think it's about 2018. And they refer to 1 football field being lost to salt every hour in Western Australia. That is pretty scary. And why? Why does this happen? How the salt gets on the land is another long story, which I won't get into. But it used to be kept down when the deep roots of the trees were there, when the trees were there, holding down the salt, if you like, and not allowing the rainwater to reach those deep depths of where the salt was. But the trees are gone. They have been cleared, over-cleared, and the salt has risen to the top. And that has become a massive problem in Western Australia. Good soil is being turned into salt. There are solutions, there are trials, all sorts of things happening, and that's ongoing. But I just wanted to share a couple of other little things before taking you on something that's very special to me. So, Trillion Trees, again, connecting people to the actual happenings of what's there in the world, what's going on with climate change, if you like. People come out to just enjoy tree planting. And we do that through so many different ways. We start traditions. So there's one where Roseanne Scott, in fact, following in the Richard St. Barbe Baker tradition, works with young people, taking them out on a special day of a year into the wheat belt, taking busloads of them out there. Wheat belt is our sort of countryside. And they spend a whole weekend tree planting. It's called Activate Youth Tree Dance Party. And it's still going on. But what they do is they plant trees all day. Come the evening, they crank up the music, have a dance party, sleep in swags overnight, and do the same again the next day. And these crew of people, sometimes it's about 200 of them, they plant about 30,000 to 40,000 trees on a weekend. And some of those young people, most of them from the city, some of those young people have now become leading environmental change agents in so many different ways. So it shows what the connections can do. And we have also children's forests. 18 hectares have been planted by tiny tots and their families. And now second generations are coming through and the parents are showing them the forests that they planted, and the children are now increasing that. And there is also school programs. We have memorial groves. We have everything for different age groups. So, and more recently, the Trillion Trees Challenge, where we invite people to come and get involved and start a tree planting tradition in their family. And from there, our tree planting traditions, we have a big pot of soup, all vegan, Scott, you'll be pleased to know. So it fits everyone. There's no, exclusion of anyone. Beautiful big pots of soup. And that's a wonderful tradition. Sit around, we have people talking, and this is at lunchtime and things like that. So it's a lovely tradition to have, and a lot of people are coming to it. But here's something I would really like to just share. So we know trees do a lot of good. They remove carbon. Trees are the skin and the lungs of the earth. And I think they are the second most important element for life on Earth. What's the first one? Let's leave it for now. I'll come back to that in a bit. But for now, I'd like you to take your mind to a favorite place of yours. It can be something from a time gone past, or it can be now. But just take your mind there as though you are visiting that place now. And in that place, first see what is around you, the shapes, the forms, the colors, the textures. Take it all in as though you were painting a picture. Now stay in this place, because a place has got different layers. And this time, remember what connections this place has for you, this favorite place of yours. Do you go there to be by yourself? Do you go there with family and friends? Who do you relate to in that space? Do you bring your dog there or a horse? Do you have a favorite tree in that place or a rock? Something you connect to, maybe a park bench even. What do you connect with in that place? Now, you're still in that place, but something else has happened. Maybe a rustle of leaves, wind in the leaves, light, a flicker of light, sound of birds, a thought that has come to your head. And in an instant, you are transported into a dimension of peace and wonderment. Okay, short trip, come back here. So that is something I call the 5 dimensions of place. And every time I've used this little experiment with different settings and different workshops, and I ask people then, where did you go to? And what was in that place? 80% of time, there were trees in their favorite place, and there was water in their favorite place. And I think water is the most important, the number one, and then trees second on the planet. You all can argue with me with that, that's fine. But they're looking for water on Mars and places, aren't they? So anyway, this comes back to, we do need the water for the trees to go on. But trees, connection to trees is so important, and it just opens up why we need to do things differently. And I think through the work of planting trees, we have encouraged people to change their lives in ways that perhaps our science and our other things could not. The actual connection and the actual being with trees. Trees teach us more than we know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandra. We had a nice little journey there. It was a quick one, but it was terrific. I really appreciate that. And, really just to say that both Heloise and Sandra have highlighted a really important point, I think, a really important factor about the projects that we're looking at with My Carbon Zero. It's not just that we want to find sticks of carbon that, in the case of trees, that we want to have standing there. We actually look at a lot of these things that we call co-benefits. In the case of the trees, we know that they bring us oxygen, but they also are so important for biodiversity and all the other species out there that depend on them now in places like Western Australia, where so many of the trees were cut down for agriculture. And we know in the case of Husk that, as Heloise mentioned, the farmers are benefiting, but on top of that, we're seeing the yield increases. But what's really fascinating is that because the biochar is there, the farmers don't have to put in so much fertilizer. And when they do put on their fertilizer, it's held by the biochar, so it doesn't go off into the streams. So the stream side ecology around where the farms are gets to improve, because not only and likewise they don't need to use so many pesticides, and the insecticides they are using are the natural insecticides that are coming as a result of the biochar. So we're finding that we're really interested in projects that have these co-benefits, and and it's not, and I think that in both cases, and Sandra has captured it, I think, so beautifully, the community connection to nature through the tree planting is something that's immeasurable, and it's just terrific. And likewise, the ancient traditions of biochar production that Heloise is bringing, connecting people back to in Cambodia is terrific. So look, we just wanted to come up with a final slide before throwing it open to more more questions is really just, how do you get started with My Carbon Zero? And Heloise mentioned that video, and Lydia in the chat has posted a link to that video, but it's there on my LinkedIn profile. We'll make sure it's posted there on our My Carbon Zero website, which is part of the Pond Foundation website. But how do you get started? Well, we've got 3 approaches for different, well, actually a little bit more than 3, but basically under individual, family, and business. And so the idea with the individual approach is exactly what I'm doing. So as an individual, you can say, I'd like to take responsibility for my carbon emissions, and I would like to reduce my emissions, so R1, reduce emissions elsewhere, R2, and I'd like to remove my carbon from the atmosphere. And lastly, I'd like to inspire other people to do the same. So we have this community that we've set up, and the website is there at the bottom, mycarbonzero.community. There we go. Thanks, Sam. Sam's posted the links there. So we have mycarbonzero.community is where these plans are identified. So you can have what we call the self-managed plan. So under the self-managed plan, you become a member of the community. There is a fee for that, and all the fees are there on the plans. I'm not going to go through that now, but you become a member of the community. You get access to that community, and inside the community, there's a lot of tools for you to work out your own carbon balance sheet, and there's blogs, there's actions that you can take. So that's a more self-managed approach. And so under the full service plan, a lot of people are really busy and they don't want to do that themselves. So we've set up with the full service plan that we will actually do it for you. So under both plans, when you join, we'll work out your carbon liability, your carbon balance for your life, and we'll set up a carbon balance sheet for you. On the self-managed plan, you then take action with your own investments. Under the full service plan, we do that for you. Okay. Now we're mindful that there are families who would want to get involved in this as well. Mum and dad and kids, and families of all shapes and sizes would like to perhaps dive in this together. And so there's a family plan as well, where we will work out the carbon balance for your entire family, and then we'll help you, if you want it, to make those investments to your R1 actions, your R2 actions, and your R3 actions. And of course, we invite you to inspire other people to follow. And then there's the business plan. So as a business, going beyond your own personal footprint, what about your business footprint? So we have a way of engaging there with businesses where we can help a business, since its inception, work out its carbon footprint. And we did this with TFT. It was about 10,000 tonnes since we'd started TFT back in 1999 that TFT is responsible for removing from the atmosphere. We can do this with businesses to help them start their My Carbon Zero journey as well. Now, down here, you'll see pledging and buying CRCs. Some people may not wish to join our community that we've established, and they might want to just get on and do it themselves. 2 ways to do that. Well, within a link to My Carbon Zero, you can just pledge, which means you can say, look, here's 200 euros. Please go and invest that in carbon removal credits. And we will blend that investment amongst our project partners, which today is Tree and Trees and Husk. And I should say, we've got a number of projects that we're onboarding now to broaden out that scope. And so, for example, we're looking at projects in the built environment and blue carbon projects with mangroves, seagrass, and forest conservation programs that we're looking to weave in here, other tree planting projects in other parts of the world. But again, using those same criteria, that we're working with people that we know and that we trust. So if you want to just pledge, you can just put in some money and we'll invest it amongst our partners. And likewise, you might want to just actually go in there and say, look, I really want to buy some carbon removal credits from Tree and Trees. Maybe want to do that with Husk. There's a way you can do that there on the website. There's a page where you can click through and say, look, I'm going to buy a Tree and Trees credit today. And away you go. Husk, other projects in the future. All of that is explained on the Pond Foundation, My Carbon Zero pages, it's there, and then the My Carbon Zero community. Sam, I see Sam and Lydia are answering some questions there. Coming to the next slide, there it is. So I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's really just an example of my personal liabilities. We worked this out, so I hope you can see it. 31 years living in Australia, because of the fossil fuel energy. We use coal to generate energy there generally. That's changing now, which is great. But when I was a young person, it was predominantly coal. I lived in Victoria. We have a big coal industry there. I lived in the UK for 3 years. I lived in Vietnam, much lower emissions in Vietnam. And here in Switzerland, it's about, I think, 6 or 7 tonnes a year. So my lifetime emissions, 558.2 tonnes of carbon. But then we worked on my carbon balance sheet. And so, for example, I was able to reduce some of those emissions living in Switzerland by and Heloise mentioned 2015, I went vegan, and that reduces your emissions by about 70%. So my 6 or 7 tonnes plus the less traveling plus the electric car helped me bring that down to around 2 tonnes of carbon instead of 7 tonnes of carbon. And that's how I've managed to reduce my overall emissions. The amount of rubbish that I throw on the street has been reduced by 36 tonnes. I've bought 72 tonnes of carbon removal credits from Husk, and I've bought 80 tonnes of carbon removal credits from Trillion Trees. So overall, on my assets, I've got 188 tonnes. You put that against my 553 of liabilities, my lifetime emissions, which of course is growing every year. It's growing as I live, but it's growing by less now because of my changed behaviour. So my overall carbon balance at this stage is reduced to 365 tonnes of carbon, still rubbish on the street that I've got to deal with. Now, you might notice here, what I haven't included is the investments that I'm making in girls' education that I mentioned earlier. And that's the difference between, that's part of the difference between my carbon zero and offsetting. Because I'm putting money into girls' education, and the suggestion is that the numbers aren't very clear on what that means. So there's some numbers out there that would suggest that I worked this out with Sam, and the amount of money that I'm putting in every year, I may be, the numbers are a bit ropey, helping reduce emissions by 400 tonnes in other parts of the world. But I don't know that. And I could just say, well, I'm giving $100 to girls' education, therefore I don't have to worry about all of my rubbish that's on the street. But that's not the case. And my view is that rubbish is still out there, and I need to get it off, regardless of what I do, investing in those R2 actions. And so that's the difference between my carbon zero and offsetting. I'm not bringing in that investment into the girls' education into my carbon balance sheet. I hope that's clear. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, it's a bit funny how the slide, I don't know if you can see that it's questions, that the S is down the bottom there. Sorry about that. It seems to be gone a bit funny with the presentation, but we really do want to open it up to questions. And I see that there are some there. I think Sam has been replying to some of them, and Lydia too. So maybe I can just start at the bottom and start working up. And Tillman has given us a question. Can lifetime flight miles be included explicitly in the lifetime carbon emissions? So what, and Tillman is an expert on these things. What we've been doing, Tillman, is really trying to separate out that personal carbon footprint versus a business carbon footprint. A little bit earlier in the chat, I saw Peter mention all of the miles that he's flown a lot with his work. And so what we're looking at is saying, okay, what's the average per capita emission in a particular country? And that'll include a few flights in a personal emission. So it'll factor in someone's taking some flights for holidays. Now, so that's the personal emissions. On the side of that, you've got the business emissions. So for example, I used to fly 100 flights a year minimum, long haul flights with TFT. And we've included that in TFT's liability, and my own flights that I took with my family are in my personal liability. And so my sense is that if you feel you've done a bit more of those personal flights than the average person, you can add up 20%. You can add on 20% or 30% or 40% to come up with a more accurate calculation of your carbon balance sheet, if that makes sense. So the answer is yes, but we're looking to separate that personal from the business so that we can focus first on personal, and then those flights taken with work can look at that. Okay, so here's a question. Is the gold standard still the best sort of CRC to be found? So I believe that was, so look, I'm not a great fan of certification in general. And what I believe with a lot of the projects that we're looking at with My Carbon Zero is, look, if someone happened to have a certification, they wouldn't be cancelled out from being a My Carbon Zero project. But what I do know is they've probably spent a lot of money and a lot of time to get that project developed, and a lot of money on getting audited. And in some cases, it can be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars go into these processes. And then they get a carbon credit. When they finally do get the money, it's not very much. I'd rather see those hundreds of thousands of dollars going into tree planting and community building in Western Australia, or in helping small farmers put biochar into their soils. So we're not a great fan here at My Carbon Zero certification processes, because they've got great holes in them. And I know folk working in this area trying to develop projects, and it's seldom that the numbers add up. And a lot of the development is about making the worst case scenario, so that they can say, look, if you don't invest in this project, this is going to happen. But if you do, then the difference is this. So the aim is to make that difference as big as possible, so that you can sell more credits. So it's all a bit chickens' entrails pointed towards Venus. The gold standard is pretty good. There's some good things out there, but it's not required for a My Carbon Zero project, because we want Sandra and Heloise and our future project partners to be investing their scarce money and scarce time in the great work that they're doing, not torturing themselves trying to get certified. I hope that helps.
Could I just add to that, Scott?
Please.
So the debate on the certification of carbon removal credits in the voluntary market, that we're all operating in the voluntary market, not the regulated market, which is comes out of the Paris Agreement and so on, and gives industry certain targets. But within the voluntary market of carbon credits, both Gold Standard and Vera, yes, are the largest players, in that they're the ones that are currently emitting the largest quantity of certificates for carbon sequestration generally. But neither of them currently have a methodology for biochar. So this is, just to build on what Scott's saying. In the case of Gold Standard, they are developing a process to develop the methodology for recognizing biochar as a carbon removal technology, but I estimate it'll be a year or two before it's ready. So that's Gold Standard. And also, as Scott was saying, the prices that the projects are getting, because it only makes sense if you really have large volumes, are around $10 a ton. In the case of Vera, which is now kind of taken over, as someone said in the chat as well, I think it's perhaps even larger than Gold Standard. I do know now that they've just agreed to develop a methodology for biochar, but again, it will cost a significant amount, and it's going to take some time. And what we don't have, going back to Scott's first slide, is time. And I think yes, certifications exist, and they're developing protocols and methodologies and so on. But at the same time, what we need is, companies and organizations like Trillion Trees, like Husk, to be removing carbon from the atmosphere today. And where we are with biochar, because it's quite pioneering in the carbon sequestration, tree planting has much more history. We're kind of carving the way. So we're delighted to be on this platform, because this does give us the potential to to access funds for the carbon that we're sinking. And we're not entirely against certification, but at the moment there is no certification for biochar in Cambodia. So what we've done is we've actually worked with the European Biochar Certificate that does have a carbon sink certificate. They've never done anything outside Europe or the US, and we've said, look, we'll pioneer your methodology. We'll just to go through the process to understand how we calculate best the carbon that we're removing. So we're working with the existing methodologies out there, but the point is that there aren't many. And also, just as Scott said, they're wieldy, they're slow, and sometimes the prices are really very low. So I think it's great that we create initiatives like this that kind of can go faster, perhaps, than some of these existing mechanisms. Sorry if I've gone on. There is another question about biochar specifically.
Yes.
Shall I come back to that
Yeah,
after?
No, do go ahead. It's from
Let's go ahead with
Elaine, about Elaine, about
Yeah, so
carbon neutral.
Elaine has asked, yeah, so how, so in the past, it's interesting. So in the past, when biochar was made by Moivisna and his family and many others, they would have physically a pile of the biochar and then this metal tube at the top. And so where the biochar is cooked is inside the pile in a relatively oxygen-starved environment, because it's literally being sort of steamed within the pile of rice husk. Because there's not that much oxygen in that environment. I mean, it's not hermetic because it's a pile of rice husk, right? But it's reduced amount of oxygen. What happens is you're transforming the carbon in the rice husk into fixed carbon, and the oxygen and some carbon dioxide is being released. But the point is that the carbon that's left for the soil is fixed carbon. So you're not, if you were to just burn open air, combust the rice husk, all of it would go into carbon dioxide. The carbon and the oxygen would match and it would be carbon dioxide. Because you starve the environment of oxygen, what you're doing is separating the carbon from the oxygen, so the carbon stays in the soil in this case. It's not hermetic in the traditional ways, but when you have pyrolysis technology, effectively what you're doing is creating an oxygen-starved environment, and strict pyrolysis would add nitrogen, which means there is no oxygen. Therefore, you cannot create CO2 because there's no O to match the C. So ours is not with nitrogen. Ours is just a more traditional rudimentary pyrolysis system that we use at the moment. So what that means is that we fix the carbon, we put it into a stable state, and we've had this lab tested, so we know exactly that we have 48% of carbon in our biochar, and that stays in the soil. I hope that clarifies. The other point perhaps to make about pyrolysis and well, about rice husk is what usually happens to rice husk is today is that it's burnt, therefore it's combustion, it's burnt and used as a cheap fuel. So this means burning in oxygen, so therefore the CO2 goes straight up into the atmosphere. And what we're doing is avoiding the rice husk being burnt, separating the carbon from the oxygen. Sorry if I've taken up too much time talking about pyrolysis and so on, but I hope that clarifies.
No, it's important. So thanks, Heloise. And look, I'll just quickly, Tom asked a question. I've just been putting my thoughts in the chat there around this. You know, I'm buying a flight ticket, and I get an opportunity to pay €2 to offset the carbon. Look, I've just never done that. It just doesn't seem credible to me. The numbers just don't add up. And even some of the projects are gold standard, but even the gold standard projects, you know, it's a bit chickens and trails towards Venus with the calculations of the numbers. And look, I just don't think it's credible. And I would rather, honestly, take my €30 and say, here, Sandra, or here, Heloise, take this money and do your good work. I just wanted to, and look, I don't know so much about these other projects, and I do know that some of them are good. I'm not against supporting gold standard projects. I just want to really make that clear. But I do want to know a lot more about them. I've been talking to recently some wonderful small NGOs around the world who are looking to plant trees in Uganda, for example, is one of them. And they're working so beautifully with these communities, exactly the sort of thing that Sandra was talking about. And they just can't get access to any finance. And yet you see what they're doing. You think this is a beautiful project. And imagine if I could, instead of, you know, and they've been looking at trying to get themselves certified, and they've got all these carbon calculations. They know what they're doing, but they just can't get it up through the development process. A, because it's very complex. B, because it takes them time. They want to be out in the bush with the communities. C, it's hugely expensive. And D, they're probably going to get 3 cents from it after it's all done. And I'd rather say, forget all that. Here's €30 or here's €1,000. Go and work with those communities to do your great work. And so that's the approach. And so for me, the logic behind My Carbon Zero was that there wasn't really a credible alternative for me. And yes, Georgina, yes, the accreditation process is problematic, I believe, for some really great projects. And I'm saying, forget the accreditation projects, just focus on the great project. And 30 years of working out in the bush, I can tell a great project from a not great project. But I don't want you to just trust me, because it sounds like I'm saying don't trust the certification, trust Scott Poynton. I'm not saying that. What we do want to do is give you transparency. For example, by meeting Sandra, by meeting Heloise, we're going to put loads of information, and we've got links to their websites there on our My Carbon Zero site, and they're also in the My Carbon Zero community, so that you can judge these things yourself. We're aiming to be completely transparent. Like, Sandra, I bought, I invested in 560 trees, and Leo, who works with Sandra, he sends me a video. He goes out and visits the trees, and he sends me a video of the trees. Here they are. I'm like, this is terrific, and I haven't been able to go and do that with Heloise because of the COVID. But I've had a tour of their factory on Zoom, and look, I'm working. These people are completely transparent, and I don't want to say to Heloise or to Sandra, okay, look, now go and please invest $100,000 that you don't have to get yourself certified, and then I'll give you 3 cents for your carbon credits. I want them to get the money now and to put those trees in the ground, because I go back to that initial philosophy of why I started this, is that we're cooking. And, this was 2014, and all of my fears about the forests burning are happening now in Australia, in Brazil, in all of these countries, in Siberia, the Arctic forests are burning. All of these things are happening now. So we haven't got time to ask Sandra and Heloise and these other wonderful organizations around the world who are doing great work to torture themselves with getting certified. I want you to do your work now. I want you to build those communities that you're doing now. So that absolutely is the logic of My Carbon Zero. And we really want to inspire as many people as we can to understand that we don't have to go blindly and wait for governments to turn that curve and close the deep poo gap. We can do it ourselves. We can do it ourselves. And that's the logic of My Carbon Zero. I don't want to wait for other people. I have been, and we haven't got very far. So the real logic of My Carbon Zero is to say, we can take responsibility for this ourselves. Here's some great folk doing some great work. Let's support them, and we may be too late, but at least we'll go into the future knowing we've given it our absolute best. And if we get to 6 degrees and there's no large mammals, it won't be for want of trying. And I think that's the most important thing. And it won't be for want of building communities who work together to struggle as that unfortunate future unfolds. Or we might just turn it around. And I know that if we don't try, we won't turn it around. And so this is the logic of My Carbon Zero. Let's get in there and let's do this. And let's give it our best shot with terrific partners like Sandra and Heloise. So that really is the unique selling point, I think, of My Carbon Zero, a wonderful community that we're trying to build to take responsibility for this challenge that we're facing into the future. I'm conscious of the time. Also for you, Sandra, it's getting late there. Any last word from you, Sandra and Heloise, before we bid our guests farewell? And thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. We have been recorded, so we will share this, and please do feel as a participant you can share this as broadly as you can, because we really want to inspire people. So Sandra, so that you can get to bed soon, thank you so much for joining us. Any last words?
I just come back to the spirit of trees and the spirit of community, because that's what I love about the organisation, which has been there in Western Australia for 41 years now, and on that almost 100-year legacy. It's wonderful if you move around with people like that. And there's so many who start in that space with no knowledge at all. And after one planting season and one cycle, they are experts, and they are helping other people to move into it. And that's the magic that has to happen. We have to embrace more and more, and the multiplier effect has to go on. Thank you for this opportunity, Scott.
Thanks, Sandra. Heloise?
Thank you very much, Scott. And I guess, my last words, building on what Sandra is saying, is that anything that we've done as a species for thousands and thousands of years must have some sense in it. People have been planting trees for, well, I don't know if it's 1,000 years. I'm not the tree planting expert. But I do know, I am the biochar expert, and I do know that people have been making biochar, they've been carbonizing biomass for thousands of years. And, right now in this time of crisis and, this gap, I think really the wisest thing is to look at those solutions that have been operating, that we have been doing for thousands of years. For some reason, Viesna and his family have been putting biochar on their soil because it makes the soil soft. And if we can scale up and use technology, innovation, distribution models, marketing, communication to scale up these amazing indigenous historic practices and zap them into our kind of current crisis, then I think we're onto something, some potential solution to get through this, And I feel very honored and grateful that I actually get to work in this, and this is my job. So if anyone can support us and help us to continue to take this ancient wisdom and scale it up into a better future for everyone, then fantastic. So thanks very much, Scott and Sandra and the rest of the team who haven't been able to speak, but I know you're busy working there as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Heloise. And look, last comment just to say about these ancient practices. It's absolutely fascinating that all around the world where forest conservation has been most successful, it's through Indigenous communities. The Indigenous communities around the world are so tied to areas where forest still remains in a good condition. And so where there was a lot of forest, there probably wasn't a long tradition of tree planting in the way that we're doing it now, because there wasn't the devastated lands that needed to be planted. But this long connection of people and forest and trees goes back tens and tens of thousands of years. And so the work that Sandra is describing of bringing those communities back in touch with nature is an ancient tradition. And I agree with you, Heloise. I think we must look to those ancient traditions to be our saviours in these challenging times. Look, I think we probably do need to finish up. I see Nicholas just had a question there about the My Carbon Zero plans, and Sam's put some stuff there. Look, if anyone's got any more questions, please do reach us. contact@thepondfoundation.org. contact@thepondfoundation.org. If you can't remember that, just go to the pondfoundation.org website and you'll be able to contact us there. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Our launch webinar, it's pretty exciting to think we've done this. Thank you again, Sandra and Heloise, for joining us. Absolute pleasure to have you with us, and so excited about what we're going to be doing together. So thank you, everyone. That's the end of our webinar, and look forward to communicating with you again in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.